I have more than that because I get your time,
17.
Right? 17, okay. Well, you brought me really wonderful news, which is that it rained on my garden, so thank you very much. I want to thank you for the opportunity you've given me to come to this really beautiful state, this beautiful city, to support your efforts to look truthfully at where we all are going, and to try to figure out how here you might create a model of something that we could all imitate. I knew that Wes would give you the long view of agriculture, so I'm giving you a pretty short view of agriculture. But as I sat here this morning listening to this wonderful speakers who really moved me and made me think a lot of new thoughts, I found myself feeling, I felt more parachuted in than Steve did, in the sense that I don't know this part of the country, and food is local, food habits are local, so I'm feeling like an outsider, and I hope you'll forgive me if what I say is not totally relevant to you. Many years ago, when I entered the field of nutrition from a background as a college pre-med and a brief stint as a journalist for Time magazine, my chemistry professor suggested that I should do that. I was not a bad chemistry student, I don't mean that, but he knew I was unhappy. I discovered instantly that the official boundaries of my newly chosen field did not encompass agriculture. Indeed, in an early encounter with another student who had graduated as a nutrition major from a land-grant college, I was told that being interested in nutrition didn't necessarily mean you had to be interested in food. Literally. But since I felt certain somehow that unless people learn to eat right food, we weren't going to get anywhere as nutrition educators. So I decided to stroll off the reservation and try to look at the things that really interested me. Once I started to read about what was actually happening out there in the fields, I realized that what I remembered as a farm from my family's regular return to their roots in Iowa no longer existed. The farm of storybook, and I must say even now toy store and computer games and so forth, with the red barn and its attached pigsty and the cows grazing in the field, was a romantic memory. Not only was the farm of my memory disappearing, but I very rapidly concluded that our overall food production system was heading in an unsustainable direction. In a book I wrote in 1978, you probably can figure out how old I am, I presented a series of issues that seemed urgently threatening at the time. The inescapable need to limit resource use on a finite planet, the threat of population growth, the alarming energy intensiveness of the food system, unchecked soil erosion, the contamination of our lands and waters with pesticides, herbicides, and other persistent organic pollutants, the problem of overfishing, the growing hole in the ozone layer and its effects on, among other things, the organisms at the base of the ocean food chain. And last but by no means least, I spent a couple of chapters commenting on the absurdity of the food supply and the consequent distractions of the marketplace created by the food industry's search for profit through frantic product multiplication and incessant advertising. I concluded that these and other changes were moving us in a direction incompatible with food security and long-term human survival. Meanwhile, as farmers began to specialize under the push of industrialization, farming itself had broken into two distinct parts. There was, on the one hand, commodity agriculture, producing feed for livestock and the raw materials for the products, not foods, but products, that fill the store shelves. And these crops, corn, soybeans, wheat, and here in the South, of course, you were growing cotton and tobacco, were grown most profitably in places where there were vast level acreages to put under the plow. The other part of agriculture was the production of fruits and veggies that used to be grown on all these farms to some extent, from coast to coast. By the 20th century, their production had increasingly moved to California, so that the state now produces nearly half of U.S. grown fruits, nuts, and vegetables, and is essentially the only producer, 99% or more, of such crops as grapes and raisins, almonds, pistachios and walnuts, dates and figs, clingstone peaches, pomegranates, and artichokes. 100%. This in a state that depends on precious subsidized water that is increasingly threatened and disappearing. Now, in the 40 years since I began paying attention the general state of commodity agriculture has gotten worse at an accelerated rate. Faced with the evident environmental problems of big ag, the giant seed and chemical corporations brought forth genetically engineered seeds, which were so heavily promoted to farmers as problem solvers that they were adopted more rapidly than any agricultural innovation in our history. Since most of these seeds were engineered to be resistant to Monsanto's patented glyphosate-based herbicide Roundup, more than 70% of this year's corn, soy, and cotton acres will be covered with plants that do not die when they are drenched with glyphosate. And now, as was predicted by those of us who were wary of this new fix for industrial agriculture, giant weeds resistant to Roundup are appearing in farmers' fields, especially here in the South. The pictures of giant pigweed that have appeared in southern fields are astonishing. They break tractors. 80% of Georgia growers, for example, reported having glyphosate-resistant weeds on their farms in 2012. And resistance is spreading rapidly, with astonishing speed, actually, so that the Mid-South and Midwest states are catching up. Between 2011 and 2012, acres with resistance almost doubled in Nebraska, Iowa, and Indiana. Moreover, there have been persistent reports that in response to their bombardment with glyphosate, the soil biota on which plant life, and by extension our lives, depend for survival are being altered in ways that are making Roundup-ready crops dangerous to the livestock that eat them. The response from agribusiness to these alarming livestock reports has been to attack the messenger and deny. The response to the weed resistance problem has been to engineer a next generation of seeds carrying resistance to more dangerous herbicides like 2,4-D, so that unsustainable industrial agriculture can stagger on, though it is past evident that resistance to such fixes by even newer superweeds will inevitably develop. So much for commodity agriculture. It is desperately in need of rescue. Meanwhile, across our continent and around the world, non-commodity agriculture has begun to take a very different direction. It's true that California still produces a staggering percent of our products, 90% of the leaf lettuce, 83% of romaine, and 83% of fresh spinach, for example, even though we've eaten well and know that we can get local lettuce without importing it from California. But around the country, it is beginning to dawn on people raised on well-traveled produce that the best fresh foods can be produced locally, and that having what's in season is delicious. So despite California's dominance, there's been a noticeable movement in many parts of the country towards small entrepreneurial farmers growing local fruits and vegetables and selling them directly to consumers by a variety of arrangements. I want to devote the remainder of my time this afternoon to discussing just how that has come about and how those of us promoting eater-to-farmer connection as a way of pushing the overall food system in the right direction might even broaden consumer concerns to help repair the problems of commodity farmers. Early in the 70s, various observers of the U.S. food system, including myself, began to ask how we could draw the public's attention to the damage that was being done around the world by the ways in which we were growing food. As a nutrition educator, I was supposed to be teaching people what to eat, but I felt that my mandate should be broader than that. I thought they ought to know where on earth those marshmallow-enriched purple breakfast cereals came from and how the planet that they derived from was faring. I thought that people out there needed to understand something about the food system in order to help change it, but how could that happen? Dazzled by the abundance of our heavily processed, technicolored food supply, U.S. consumers had been isolated for several generations from the origins of their food. They had no understanding of how their demands for fatty meats, for exotic foods, for out-of-season produce, and for compositionally mysterious products whose processing, packaging, and transport required substantially more energy than they contained. How these demands threatened our agricultural resource base and the planet as a whole. We needed consumers to produce change, but they were clueless. As I worked to solve this conundrum, I wrote the following. I am grateful to have discovered in the writing of an anthropologist the very useful term relocalization to encompass many of the changes that look most promising where food is concerned. I wrote that in February of 1978, which for those of you who have forgotten how to add and subtract without a smartphone is almost exactly 35 years ago. I was aware then that a network of concerned people across the country was trying to find routes to sustainability in general, and in some places to food in particular. Fuel prices had escalated rapidly in the 70s because of the cutoff of Middle Eastern oil by what was then a new organization, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. And concerned about the high energy cost of shipping food all over the place, several small groups, particularly in the Northeast, were looking for the first time at their own food chain, asking what could be done in a time of high fuel prices about the heavy dependence of a state like Massachusetts on produce imported from other states. Various organizations began to ask how much of their food might be produced locally, and Rodale Press launched something called the Cornucopia Project to examine each state's potential for feeding itself. But this was the end of the 70s, and when gasoline prices dropped dramatically, and Ronald Reagan came into office declaring that it was morning in America, all that activity stopped abruptly. Everybody preferred good news, even if it wasn't true. It was almost 20 years before anything of the sort emerged again. But even before Reagan succeeded in convincing people that they didn't need to save energy or anything else, I realized how difficult it was going to be to attract people's attention to the problems that I was seeing. How hard it would be to get distracted, agriculturally ignorant Americans to give a damn about how our excessive demands were stressing the food systems of the world. There was not yet a local food movement in 1985 when I published an article called A Modest Proposal, which I copied from somebody. In it, I remarked on our increasing import of food from the Dominican Republic, a country that had at the time recently suffered from food riots because they didn't have enough food to feed their own people. I also noted there was a fad for exotic tropical fruits and vegetables from countries driven to export them by unmanageable external debt. Americans knew nothing of the heavy cost of their imported foods. The modest proposal of my title was that we create a new competition among upwardly mobile professionals. The goal of the new competition, I wrote, will be to eat from as close to home as possible. Status will be won by consuming only objects with whose life histories one is intimately familiar. Just as people used to steal each other's cooks, I suggested, perhaps we could make it fashionable to steal each other's chefs and farmers. 28 years later, the happy news is that my proposal no longer seems so modest. Lots of folks in my region have obviously gotten to the point where they're comparing farmers, but many of our fellow citizens have not. And I find it deeply distressing that the urgent issues that I wrote about in 1978 still seem shockingly relevant. It's true that there have been a few small improvements. We now have an international treaty to control the chemicals that were blowing a hole in the ozone layer and exposing us to deadly levels of ultraviolet radiation. And yes, you can now talk about organic in polite society without being accused of being a faddist. But we're still trashing the atmosphere. The ozone hole hasn't yet healed, and we're sending up tons of crap into our skies, not the least carbon dioxide and other gases that trap solar energy and warm the planet. And we have a government that seems incapable of solving any major problems. We have elected, well, the corporations have elected, a strange group of new congresspersons who don't believe in global warming, to add to the majority of our representatives who, even if they believe it's happening, don't want to do anything about it. So the headline is that as a planet and as a nation that can well afford to do better, we're heading full speed ahead toward truly scary times, which is, I believe, why most of us are here for today and tomorrow. Most of our food, of course, still comes from the industrial food system and is sourced not only from across the nation, from around the world. Most of us in the local food movement are well aware that the task of reform is just beginning. One of the barriers to change is that with the food system, unlike certain other things, we can't just shut everything off that we don't like and start over. We have about 316 million people to feed in this country, and I've been at enough all-you-can-eat restaurants to know that careful eating is not the norm. And happy as I am to be on the board of an organization that has now helped organize more than 130 CSAs in New York City, CSAs are not going to feed everyone. So what is ultimately most dispiriting to someone who has been studying and teaching about all this for more than 40 years is how resistant the larger system, the one that feeds most of us all the time, is to change. Nonetheless, 3 decades after I understood that we needed to pay attention to where our food came from, I'm truly elated by the degree to which that idea has begun to spread, at least partly in response to the shocked recognition that our fat children need protection from the nation's toxic food supply. Where eating locally is concerned, there has been remarkable change. Now there are farmers markets everywhere, and eaters in Iowa and New York and in South Carolina and in California, where it's easier, know how to find and choose local food. Moreover, committed people across the country are working on the complexities of connecting family farmers directly to quantity feeders who can provide reliable markets for what they grow. Farm to school, farm to college, farm to hospital programs, even caterers like Cisco and Aramark are looking for local foods. And there's also, whether for good or not, and I mostly think not, even Walmart. In my own region, the entire borough of Brooklyn is now a cornucopia of sumptuous local foods, winter and summer. They're even slaughtering pigs out there the way they used to in the old days. And people who used to confess with embarrassment that they lived in Brooklyn now brag about it. Moreover, nobody seems to be worrying anymore that in the cold months we'll all face starvation or succumb to scurvy from lack of vitamin C, as they used to say to me when I used to talk about it. Indeed, there's enough public interest and enthusiasm for the local food movement to have alarmed the largest industry in the U.S., the food industry. The growing enthusiasm for organic and local food, public concern over the contamination of organic farm fields by unwanted pollen from biotech crops planted in adjacent fields, the successive scares and recalls of foods, animal and vegetable, contaminated with novel microorganisms, these kinds of developments threaten the status quo. Even worse, from the standpoint of the food industry, are the widely disseminated negative images of modern animal production in films like Food, Inc., the first commercially released movie that shows some of what modern farming looks like, and in the ruthlessly detailed book by Jonathan Safran Foer called Eating Animals. All these and other threats to the ability of the complacent public to ignore the animal and human suffering behind the plastic wrap packages of industrial food are causing major organized reactions. These include not only Monsanto's ubiquitous ads suggesting that it alone can save the world from starvation with biotech, but repeated patronizing references to organics as a backyard occupation and other extended attacks on local organic food movement for its supposed inability to feed the world, that is, to be highly productive. The latter, of course, is a really interesting and odd claim, since there's now abundant documentation showing that organic is overall just about as productive as conventional agriculture in developed countries, and that in poor countries it can multiply yields many times for minimum cost. After 20 years of research and 13 years of commercialization in the U.S., genetic engineering has done little to increase overall crop yields. Yet I believe all these industry reactions end up as consumer education events and are a major reason why the part of agriculture that produces fruits and vegetables is experiencing change and farmer appreciation is growing among an increasing number of consumers. If commodity farmers need help, and they do, and they do manage most of the land, they need to find ways of modifying what they do to make their role both positive and meaningful to consumers, because I believe consumers are the way the food system has moved, the way it has already moved, has been run by consumers, which is a very positive thing. And at the moment, the commodity system doesn't produce anything consumers think they eat or that they want to know about. So it's in trouble. Somebody recently asked me if I had hope. And I said in a way I did, because we have an unsustainable food supply. And as Michael Pollan wrote in The Omnivore's Dilemma, what it means to say that something is unsustainable is that it will stop. I suspect the stunning short-sightedness of our leaders and their apparent inability to do anything directed towards saving the planet will bring us to a major food crisis much sooner than anyone except Wes expects. And what really makes me hopeful in the face of that is the existence of so many experiments on the ground all over the country. Everything from growing power in Milwaukee and farm revitalization in cities like Cleveland and Detroit, to the Intervale and the restoration of an integrated food system in Hardwick, Vermont, as well as the slow money movement, finding ways to let us all invest in local agriculture and the food system across the country. In my own overdeveloped suburban county, where the number of farms fell from 900 in the 30s to 4 in 2006, and where agriculture was declared dead by even the pro-farming organizations, we started our first new farm 2 years ago, CSA-based farm, on public land leased to us by at no cost by the county. There are going to be more and more models out there when we need them. But of course, as this conference reflects, we need to change much more than how we eat and where and how we eat, what we eat is produced. We need to change our lives because we are all living as if growth could be infinite on a finite planet. So let me begin drawing all this to a close by quoting from a Southerner I deeply admire and respect, Barbara Kingsolver, a stunning writer who, in telling wonderful stories, always tells us who we are and why. "The honorable choice I see," she recently wrote, "is to power down, stop taking airplane jaunts, repair old things, get out the clothespins, grow food, walk, and face the truth that I am party to something so enormously destructive I can hardly know its edges. The conquering of any addiction begins with these words: I am the guilty party." We are, of course, all guilty parties, not excluding those of us who grow our food as I do and then fly to South Carolina to talk. Moreover, we all know, if we are honest about it, that we will never have a sustainable food supply, or more importantly, a sustainable society, as long as the wealthiest 1% of us have more than the bottom 90% of us. A group on whose board I sit is working to create programs in underserved communities in New York City that, through community gardens, CSA, city farms, and other programs, give poor people access to fresh, local, sustainable food. As Jim Hightower said, quoting his father, "Everybody does better when everybody does better." As I read through the Coastal Conservation League's Sustainable Agriculture Initiative and learned about what it describes as South Carolina's monumental and tragic agricultural history, fueled by indigo, cotton, and rice, I found myself reminded for the first time in decades of the title of a paper I heard about sometime late in the 70s. It was called, as I remember, Colonialism and Dependency in Vermont. Oh, I thought I was through. Sorry, folks, I've got one more page. And was pointing to the fact that Vermont had a history, as most colonies did, of exporting raw materials and importing everything else, including tourists. They thought the state could do better. Several years later, the authors of that paper published a booklet in which they laid out with charts and tables just how a vegetarian diet could be put together from the foods growable in northern New England. It was, I will assure you, deadly heavy on kale, as all those early attempts were. I like kale, but there's a limit. Yet even to make such an attempt at that time, as I pointed out in my introduction to their paper, was to invite derision from enthusiasts of the status quo. In the 33 years since that paper was published, lots of things have changed in Vermont. In Vermont, it is now not only possible, but almost mandatory to embrace local food. Will Rapp has created Intervale and the town of Hardwick, where unemployment is 40% higher than the state average and incomes are 20% lower, has been widely celebrated in the press and even in a book as a town that food saved. The Hardwick-based Center for an Agricultural Economy has as its mission building a regenerative, locally based, healthy food system where business owners share advice, capital, and facilities, and they have created jobs. If they can do it in Vermont, you can surely do it in this beautiful state, where you have been blessed with a significantly milder climate. I am not surprised to learn that despite a demand for locally produced food that exceeds the present supply, less than 10% of the food South Carolinians eat is grown here, and most raw produce is still exported. But I know from what I have eaten since I arrived that your local food is terrific. And thanks to the folks who put this conference together, you here in Charleston even have a LEED-approved food hub with office and warehouse space designed to aid the marketing and distribution of locally produced food. It seems clear there really is no other way to move into the future with any sense of hope. Global food systems are not working. They will be crippled by energy costs, by food sovereignty movements around the world responding to the desire of other formerly colonial peoples to take hold of their own food futures. We have all been living through times when money has been the devastating marker of success. But money without food is useless. King Midas, who was granted his wish that everything he touched would turn to gold, starved to death. So it is time for every state and region to work to guarantee that it can feed itself. I congratulate all of you that you are setting out so intentionally and seriously to achieve that end. Thank you.
Joan, thank you. You did go over, but you were very clever. You went over exactly 5 minutes, so the panel can't ask you any questions. You'll have to wait till the audience asks you questions after Michelle finishes. So, Michelle, go ahead.
I have nothing to, what more could I say after these two? First, I would like to thank the League for their amazing work over the last 25 years in organizing this amazing gathering, and also just Joan and Wes, what a treasure they are, and we should give them a round of applause, because if change happens, it'll largely be because of them. There is hope because they're with us and they're still motivating us. Love to thank Grow Food Carolina, Lowcountry Local. You guys have tremendous hope here because you have boots on the ground making great things happen. And I'm in awe of the gathering, so I'd like to thank Dana and his team for either smoking or drinking whatever they smoke or drank that led them to decide to have me on this panel. But I'm here, and whatever you had, please give me some of it, because this is amazing. I pinched myself every minute leading up to this visit. Anyway, I'd also like to thank Gus for his awesome remark about the calendar behind him, because he had no watch in front of him that his students said. My mom always said, ask Michel what time it is, and he will tell you in great detail how a clock is built. So I hope I don't go over. Anyway, thank you all for being here and being engaged. This is an important and exciting time, and I'm going to move this because I talk with my hands. Like Judy, I had two transformational moments. As a son of displaced farmers living in and out of poverty for some time, I eventually, and an aspiring musician, I eventually got a job at a restaurant, so at least I could eat. And being raised on good food because that's all we had as a family. My mom grew her own. She shipped us down to southern Missouri to work what was left of my grandpa's farm every summer, and we canned and pickled stuff and brought it home. I thought I really had an edge, and I did. I could pickle and can blindfolded, butcher a hog, a lamb, a goat, a rabbit, a possum, a raccoon, expertly by age 12, and I was outperforming even the chefs that I was working for technically. Didn't know what to call the stuff, but I knew how to cut it and cook it. I became chef for my first time in 1981 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a restaurant called the Flourishing, and I immediately thought I would put all the other chefs out of business by outcompeting them, because I would go out to the countryside, find farmers, because I was disappointed with the quality of food coming in the back door. Well, guess what? They weren't there. There were corn, there were soy farmers. They wouldn't sell to me. I didn't want their product. Knocked on countless doors, made countless phone calls, and was finally invited through pity by a young family who had inherited their corn and soy farm to have coffee because they liked what I was trying to do, but the only thing they could offer me was some free asparagus that had migrated down from when she was a child to the roadside. So in 1981, my first and only farm-to-table acquisition was free asparagus after countless tanks of gasoline, countless telephone calls, knocking on dozens of doors, and having some of them slammed in my face. Free asparagus. Today, I'm proud to say that at my restaurant dressing room, with whom I opened with my late partner, Paul Newman, it's a place where I can make 12 phone calls and have 100% of everything that you eat come from a local producer. We don't have steak on the menu because it's only 10% of the animal, and we only buy our beef from one person, the late David Hughes of Stonebrook Farm in Warnerville, New York. My second transformational moment, much like Judy, came simultaneously when my 24-year-old son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at age 5, and I was also realizing that the only reason why I could do what I was doing as a chef who was buying local was because the people coming into my restaurant could afford to spend $30 an entree. And that was really kind of a watershed moment for me. It is what actually led to the founding of Wholesome Wave. So rather than talking to you as a chef, I'm going to talk to you about Wholesome Wave because it is all about food. Wholesome Wave is a nonprofit organization that now operates in 28 states, trying to help people in low-income urban and rural communities actually have the opportunity to encounter affordable access to locally grown foods. We were founded on two premises. One, citizens of poverty want to feed their families well. They represent a significant portion of our economy, like it or not, it's true. And that if given the opportunity, they could, together with struggling farmers, become heroes of a changed food system. I am convinced that that's going to happen. The second premise that we based Wholesome Wave on is that the sustainable food movement will only be sustainable if it can successfully transition from grant reliance to a vibrant, self-sustaining economy of its own. We are on that journey now, and I'm proud to say that I think we're all enjoying some pretty good success there. But I need to really begin by acknowledging something that's going to make maybe some folks uncomfortable. We all together in this room constitute a gathering of people largely of affluence. We don't need to turn or crank our heads and look around and know that there's a large unrepresented population here. So I'm noticing who is largely not represented in the room, and I'm going to make, but though through words mentioned earlier, which I really applaud about poverty and the lack of social justice, and how the presence of these injustices will play a large role in preventing us from realizing our vision of a healthy and whole environment. If we don't deal with whole communities, we will not have whole environments. That's all there is to it. It's just not happening. So today I'd like to honor our hidden, ignored, often forgotten citizens of poverty. When I think of these citizens and the powerful role that they can play in this conversation, I really thank David for bringing us the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. There is such thing as being too late. This reminds us of some powerful truths. They inspired me to wonder, is there such a thing as being too early? How many people in the room here feel like they were ahead of their time, Judy? And, right? Okay. That's being too early. Maybe. And then I wondered today, is there such a thing as just in time? And that's what I'd really like to base my talk on, and I'm going to go off and riff on that. I'd like to look to the next 25 years for the Coastal Conservation League by asking this question and having everybody carry it home with them. Who's not in the room that should be here? And how do we get them here as vigorous participants in this conversation? I think it's critical to understand first, because I'm talking about citizens in poverty, what the true face is of citizens in poverty. We know what the face is that's been painted for them. We've talked about Ronald Reagan several times, so I will not let him remain nameless in my conversation. The face of poverty painted during that era was of a large population of the United States gladly doing nothing and accepting handouts, lazy, not caring about contributing to an economy, and taking advantage of a broken system. That is the face of people living in poverty. That face pervades today. I want to change that with some statistics we've been gathering over the last 3 years through one of our 3 programs. We have a program now operating in 28 states where we raise private money to double the value of food stamps when they're spent at farmers markets on locally grown fruits and vegetables. Thank you. Yeah, please clap. It's a great program. It's cool. Now, here's the deal. Yeah, it makes us feel good to do this, but we do this for a specific reason. We don't believe the face that's been painted for people living in poverty, because we certainly don't give them the choice to voice what they look like and sound like on their own often. So we collected data. What happens to the consumer attitude when affordable access is addressed, and what does it mean for farmers? Here are the most important values of the doubling program. Number one value of most importance, 93% of 3,000 SNAP consumers said the most important reason for them to participate is the quality of the produce they encounter. Quality of produce. Number two, that was number 3 for the first 2 years, so I'm very excited to say, because I didn't want to have it on the survey because I thought it would rank last. 91% of those 3,000 consumers say that supporting local farmers and businesses is important to them in their decision to participate in this program. It matches with the fact that the program accepts food stamps in the first place as a reason of importance. That's powerful. 87% selection of produce, 84% taking part in the community. These match Wegmans and Whole Foods community. When they survey their community of shoppers, these are the same values that come up at Whole Foods. I hope I'm helping change the face of consumers living in poverty for you, because the one we've painted is not real. What does it mean to the farmers? 35% of 3,600 farmers diversified crop plantings to meet this new market. I know eggplant farmers who are now producing bitter melon, fuzzy melon, long beans, Puerto Rican oregano, you name it, they're producing it because their customers buy it. 15% made one kind of infrastructural investment, farm equipment, that allowed them to meet this growing market. 12% added hoop houses. Now this is a conundrum because we went back to these farmers and said, no, 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 maybe you misunderstood the study. We want only infrastructural improvements that you made because of your exposure to this program in the new market presents. And they said, no, 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 you don't understand. In the early spring and in the late fall, when it's raining, sleeting, and snowing, and white affluent people aren't coming to our markets, our food stamp customers are, with the same vigor that they do throughout the rest of the season, because it's the only affordable access they have. They have leveled out our shoulder season and made it worth being at our market. You damn right we spent money and put hoop houses on our land. Here's the great thing. 27% of all market sales in 302 markets in 26 states is from food stamps. 27% of the market at 302 markets. Tell me of any company in the United States that isn't going to pay attention to 27% of its consumer base. I'm a restaurateur. I would want to know who those customers are. Yet, we continue largely to ignore them. And that's got to change. Citizens of Poverty are making a difference for struggling farmers, and I see struggling small and mid-sized farmers not as boutique businesses, but as classic American small businesses. That's what they are, regardless of what some of the folks in conventional agriculture will say, and a lot of the folks on both sides of the aisle that support that model. These are small businesses. You increase their market share by 27%. They're adding a hell of a lot more jobs to their business plan than a big ag company is when they come up with some kind of new innovation that allows them to create a superweed. So what I'm happy to report is, as a result of sharing this data on both sides of the aisle in Washington, last year in the Farm Bill that almost made it, there's language supporting these incentives for food stamp consumers to buy locally grown fruits and vegetables, and that same language is now alive again in both versions of the House and the Senate bill that are circulating in Washington. Somebody clap. It's a good thing. Anyway, so we have a fruit and vegetable prescription program. Somebody earlier mentioned public health and the medical community not being so present. It's a huge, huge implications for conservation and for our ecosphere. Thank you, Wes. I'll always use that word moving forward, I promise you. Throw me in jail if I don't. For our ecosphere, just the medical waste that goes into treatment, we don't even know what that is. It's incredible, let alone the healthcare costs of people living with prediabetes, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, all of those things. We raise private money so that doctors, nurse practitioners, nutritionists, community health workers, and nonprofits and farmers markets work together so that entire at-risk families can use a prescription like they would use to go and get their free drugs if they actually get diabetes, courtesy of the American taxpayer. They actually get prescriptions with a monetary value so that they can increase their consumption, a serving per day per person, go back monthly to be measured for health outcomes. In 2 years in a row, 30% of that population at a 4-month intervention dropped their BMI as a result to the increased exposure to fruits and vegetables, the constant counseling of seeing their doctor, their nutritionist, their nurse practitioner once a month, and feeling like their entire community cares about them because they're being acknowledged as a citizen. And it's amazing to hear doctors say, I have a former drug addict who I worked on for 10 years that wouldn't give up drugs, and now they've been exposed to this program, and because of the incredible hope they have for improving the life of their family, they now are no longer a drug addict without the help of the psychiatrist. So it's remarkable stuff. You better believe that Obamacare and the reimbursements and the shifting of reimbursement from treatment to measurable prevention. We believe food is measurable prevention. There's money in that game for our farmers. I heard the word sea change, and those of you living in coastal lands understand sea change perhaps better than a Yankee like me. But I see a new sea change in opportunity. Who can tell me how many dollars are spent in food stamps every year? Can somebody raise their hand and tell me that? Good. It's $80 billion a year. So when I say consumers living in poverty, they spend just in food stamps, so not even the extra money that they spend when they run out of food stamps. They're spending $80 billion a year on stuff that's making all Americans overweight, obese, and putting this incredible strain on our healthcare system. $80 billion a year. We need to set free the true potential of these communities of poverty, to recapture the sea change that we once politically took for granted. In the 60s, we truly acted collectively in a way that began making a huge difference. This is a classic example of what Olivier de Schutter speaks to as citizen-led change, and perhaps the only type of change that'll really truly change the system. Think of this. Citizens of poverty share many of the emotions that fueled the Back to the Land movement in the 60s. They're pissed off. They're fed up, they're determined, they want change. Many of these citizens are not polluted by the poisonous rhetoric of individualism, as middle-class Americans are. They're totally bought in and have drunk the Kool-Aid. And this is the immigrant and refugee communities. They're just recently removed from their food culture. They hate grocery stores. And those that are multi-generational poverty are so marginalized by this poisonous rhetoric that they stand a chance of becoming powerful warriors for sea change. Now, I'll digress a little because there are some earlier conversations that were just incredibly stimulating. Growth. Yeah. Am I done?
Maybe you could spend a minute or two summarizing.
Okay, summarizing. Holy cow. Anyway, here's the deal. All right.
Okay, extemporaneous. Go
okay, we can do this. Okay. But I really want us to stop throwing the bleach bones of table scraps in the form of donations to food banks, scholarships to people in underserved communities. What about board seats on ethics committees? And not through the prism of color, not a black person on our ethics committee, a black person living in poverty, an Asian person living in poverty, a Somali living in poverty, on our ethics boards, on the boards of our educational institutions, real people living in poverty, on the boards of our nonprofit organizations that are designed to help them. How can we, when we have an educational system that's looking at the whole problems of a whole community, solve these problems if we're not inviting everybody that's participating in that community to the same table to speak? So I think we have an opportunity through food, all of us here, and great thinking, and there are great spirits in this room, to bring ourselves together in a way that all Americans are going to become a part through food of the solution that's going to restore the health of our earth so that we can all be heroes of that together. That's what we need to do. That's what makes us uniquely American, and we're going to get it done. Thank you. Thank you. I would have gone on for another half hour, man.
Well,
sorry about that.
We have had short presentations from three compelling and dynamic speakers, and I'm sure they'll entertain some questions. Yes. Wow.
I must say, I love the last presentation. I loved them all. I lived this. One of the critical things out of what you mentioned, and might have been what you wanted to continue to say.
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of stuff.
Is I think this whole face of poverty, people miss, especially in the area you're in right now, because like in our cultural community, we've always been called land rich and cash poor. So we have land, someone may own 5, 10 acres of land by themselves, and we still grow food on it because that's what our ancestors were brought here to do. Someone mentioned cotton, rice, and indigo. That are we who've been to grow that thing. So here it is, though, when people think of the board seats that you just mentioned, most of our people are not going to come to that meeting because they're already not going to trust why they're being invited. If they get to the meeting, they feel intimidated because then they get there and there's nobody that looks like them, or nobody sometimes to translate the language from that environmental world or whatever you want to call it back to the land movement into their language. And it's interesting to us, there's this new back to the land movement that looks elitist, wherein what about the remain on the land movement that we've always been a part of? And many of the people that you're talking about that get the food stamps still to supplement what they can grow, or when it's off season and they can't grow, are those folks. So again, in a situation like this, someone might appear to be in the same class as you, but not. They might have had to borrow from everybody in the family to get the money to register for a meeting like this.
We only have 10 minutes for the whole room. So, I mean, do you
Okay, yeah. Okay, got you. So how is that going to change? I mean, if all of what you said is great, but if you don't consider what the real realities are, how is what you're saying going to actually happen? How's it going to change?
I think we have to open an entire new dialogue, and I think, you know, some kind of a potluck dinner, as my ma was, when we had problems with the neighbors, she fed them. And listen, over a really good meal, you can talk about things that might get you into a fist fight if there's not food on the table, and it doesn't slow you down for a minute, and you don't go through the act of giving thanks for what's in front of you. I think we need new styles of dialogues, new styles of convenings and meeting. But I love, you know, the fact that the Still on the Land movement, and I want to honor that, because there was one thing I meant to say. Roosevelt in '43 gave a speech thanking American victory gardeners because the USDA said that in 1942 they studied that 48% of all fresh food consumed by Americans in 1942 came from privately held victory gardens. In '42, we were at half the population we are today. Do the math. A quarter of our fresh food would be coming from privately held victory gardens. It was at scale, it can be at scale again, and with all the community gardening movements that Joan is promoting and talking about in Detroit and other communities of poverty, self-reliance is being co-opted by people who don't even know what the word of that means. Imagine if communities can actually completely support themselves and not have to rely on being fed by a big agribusiness company. Yeah, maybe we just don't need that form of agriculture at all. Who really knows? I think it's scalable and doable, but I think we need to change the dialogue and everybody needs to be at the table.
Okay, another question. Back there, I think. And then there's one deep in the corner.
Good afternoon. I have a question for you, Joan. My name is John Rashford, and I'm a faculty member here at the College of Charleston, and interested in the origins of agriculture and food, and appreciated your remarks. How do you address the issue of separating industrial processes from the poor use of industrial processes to produce food? In other words, it disturbs me a lot when I encounter so many young people that think the problem is industrialization itself rather than the way in which it's being used. Is that a meaningful distinction to you, or does it? That's a good question.
I'm not sure. I have been guilty of being told. I was once in Australia and giving talks, and I said something about the problem with food supply, and somebody said we have to work with the food industry, and I said you can't work with the food industry. The difficulty is that they have a totally different goal. Their goal is to use the smallest amount of real food possible to make the most expensive product. Our goal is to get people to try to eat what's good for them. The great bulk of what's out there, they would be much better off without. And so it's very hard for me. I mean, maybe if I were younger, I'd be more flexible, but I cannot tell you how many meetings I have sat in where somebody brought together the food industry and people like me and said, okay, let's figure out a way that we can regulate so that the products are better, or that we can create better products. And I'm fairly good with words, and they would, often it would be, there would be 5 people behind the head of General Mills, and there would be me here. They always had backup troops at the meetings. And then when it came time somebody had to do something, they would pick me. So I had to go home, type it, you know, duplicate it, carry it to the post office by hand. Anyway, but I did these things, and I came up with really good ideas for how we could create a regulatory system that would prevent the kind of crap that we have in, you know, purple marshmallow enriched breakfast cereals. The minute it would get to that point, they were gone. They were gone. They set up, we had an advertising thing, and the day we had our third or fourth meeting, they were out there saying, oh, we're setting up a National Advertising Review division of children's division, and we're, you know, they won't sit still to do that. So I don't know how to work. Maybe somebody can figure out how to do it, but I don't know how to do it, because what they want to do is make a new product, and basically, I don't think with 30,000, 40,000, there were 8,000 items in the supermarket when I was born. 800, I take it back, 800. It sort of doubled by the year, and we now have 30 to 40,000 items in the supermarket. And you know, I could eat perfectly well from the 800 items that were there. You know, everything was there I needed. We now have all this stuff, and the problem of a nutrition educator, who has time to know what's in those products? I mean, you could read labels for all that gets you. And what does that mean anyway? It's all fragmented. These fragmented raw materials are reconstituted into a food product. We don't know anything about the health of those items. Nothing. And once the FDA took, Michael Pollan picked this up in his book, in his really groundbreaking book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. He picked up the fact that the FDA had taken off the rule which existed when I first started school. That is, if you wanted to make something that looked like butter that wasn't, you had to call it imitation. You had to call it imitation pudding. You had to call it imitation. They took off that regulation. All it had to do was have substantial nutritional equivalence, which means put in the right vitamins and minerals and it's equivalent. And we were, from that point on, we really had no control over what was in the food supply.
Wes, do you want industrialization versus industrial agriculture?
I try to think about this problem from the point of view of systems theory. And I think there's a general law, and that is highly dense energy destroys information of the cultural and biological varieties. And we're involved in a Sisyphus effort with our attempts to bring some sanity. I was trying to think of an illustration. In a field in which you have introduced anhydrous ammonia, which is nitrogen, your bacteria shut down. Your plants don't accommodate the nodule bacteria. Those nodule bacteria, which are anaerobic, that attach to the root, operate at 4/5 of an atmosphere using 21 enzymes. Anhydrous ammonia is created at 350 atmospheres and 400 degrees C. When you have that kind of resource coming at your system, your biological system shuts down. It doesn't matter how much that legume plant would love to be producing its own nitrogen. It just can't do it. So what I hear is a problem that has to do with social justice, a problem that has to do with health, a problem that has to do with the loss of cultural capacity. The people that left the land, especially after World War II, but before they were already, it is roughly proportional to the increase of highly dense carbon coming into those systems. A corn plant is lazy. It won't do any more than you expect of it. It won't develop resistance. It won't have resistance if it doesn't need resistance to a pathogen. I believe there are ghost-like qualities associated with and is proportional to the density of the carbon coming into the system. And I think what we're doing is pumping our fists and blaming ourselves, but in a way we're like children in a candy store. And been told you can have as much as you want. But then we see that some of the children get sick. And so you want to do something to restrict that from happening. But as long as those candy stores stay open and the children are free to come in, you know, they're going to go for it. And so I think what our side needs to do, I'm not disagreeing with anything that's been said, but I think what our side needs to do as we think about the industrial versus the more sensible is appreciate that there are, I'll call them ghost-like factors at work that override our consciousness of what's really wrong. And, you know, well, okay, yeah, sure.
I think we got the gist of the answer.
Well, I got more to say.
I know you do. And there is time after this to meet with the panel.
So this is a food chain discussion, and I'm a farmer. I'm being invaded by 4 invasive species, not counting just within the past couple of years, those that were already here invading the area. I look for information, for help, and my land-grant institution, the other colleges and universities. Where can I get help?
Okay, who wants to take on invasives? Wow. Joe? Yeah, sure. Wes? Okay,
I'll tell you where you can. Yeah, I'll tell you where you can get help. Read the yearbooks of agriculture before 1940.
Joan, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm interested in what the invasives, you mean insects and diseases? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Not crops, not biotech crops or anything? Okay. I think it's happening to all of us. They're all moving because of global warming, so we get all these novel things and the novel weeds. I have novel kinds of grass in my yard I've never seen before. So I think we're all going to have to go through a very serious period of adaptation, and I wish the land-grant colleges would catch up, but if they, how we get that changed, Wes should tell us.
Michelle. I would say just a quick plug for the Rodale Institute. They have the longest standing side-by-side certifiable, conventional certified organic study of what happens year after year after year after year, and they're dealing with exactly the same thing, but the resilience of the organic is starting to show stronger and stronger and stronger every year. It's been outpacing conventional for quite some time, but that it's open source. So I really would encourage you to reach out to them. They've been a little bit silent because there have been just, you know, passings in the family. Maria Rodale now is the president of the Institute, and they really want to drive to make this information more viable because they see the tensions that the changing environment are creating, and they're having some success in these side-by-side studies with a lot of these invasives, so I would encourage you to go there.
Okay, one more question. I think there's one deep in the corner, or is it we've addressed it? Okay, anyone else? Last question, incredibly pithy. Yes. You can do it jointly.
She already had a question. I'd like to ask Wes, what about feeding refugees in the world? We have just announced today that 500,000 people are eating somewhere out of their country in Syria, and then we have the Palestinian, we have the Sudanese, the Congo, refugees? Where does that food come from?
Well, a lot of it comes through the various food programs of like everything from the National Council of Churches to some of the food that is made available through USAID and whatnot.
I think the question is where, if you change the agricultural system, you still have the same volume of crops.
Well, you know, I think we don't appreciate to what extent the most important invention of the 20th century does. I mean, without it, 40% of humanity wouldn't be here now. It's the Haber-Bosch process that turns atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. And, you know, there are a lot of third world type countries that are getting the benefits of Haber-Bosch.
Joan, do you have any?
Yeah, I'd like to make a seriously political comment, which is that we've really spent.
We accept that on this panel.
Oh, I know. I'm well aware of that. I'm sorry. We've spent a lot of time in this country and a lot of effort and a lot of grain and a lot of exports making people dependent on us. So the best thing we can do is to try to help countries. I mean, the first thing that happened when we took over Iraq, I don't know if you have read about this, but you know, when Brennan went in and was the high mucky-muck, one of the first things that happened was they made sure that they would allow biotech in. Now, that didn't seem to me to be a high priority in Iraq. We had already wiped out most of the farmers with all the bombardment and everything, but that's what it was. So we really are guilty of creating a lot of the hunger around the world, and the best thing we could do would be to reform our agencies which did that. I mean, I used to give to my students a brochure that AID put out called Aid, What's in It for You? Because most of the money we sent overseas came back in contracts for American contractors. So it's like we're terrible sinners, and we need to back off from that and let people feed themselves. That's what I meant about food sovereignty. That's the big move now. And I know the refugee problem is horrendous, but part of the refugee problem is also resource poor countries or countries who haven't managed to free themselves from colonial whatever. Right. You know, we have a lot of leftover problems.
I'd like to close by saying there are refugees of war, but there are also refugees of agriculture, literally by the hundreds of millions that have been displaced from indigenous lands for clear cutting, for vast soy and corn and maize production, that when they were left alone, they weren't contributing to the economy per se, but they were raising goats and raising their own food, working in the jungle with indigenous plants and cultures, completely self-reliant for millennia, who are now in the slums of Sao Paulo and countless cities in Africa, and needing India. Free food because their right to be able to produce for themselves has been taken away. So there are many kinds of refugees that often are victims of the symptom. I think the problems are big, and we're going to need big ag for some time. But over time, I envision a lot less giant, eventually it going away, tons more mid-size, and millions more small, getting back to the self-reliance that we've taken away that caused the problem in the first place.
Let me just recommend one book I read on the way here, so it's very much at the top of my mind. It's by Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things and won a Pulitzer or some prize. I don't remember the Man Booker Prize. And she has not written another novel since she has taken on her country, which is India. And I just read her book, a very little short book called Walking with the Comrades, which is about her going back into the woods of India, into the area where the untouchables and the Maoists have been working, and looking at the whole question of what these people are really doing. Are they really in rebellion against India? Are they really wildly whatever? And it's just, she's a very thoughtful person, and it's a wonderful book. And I thought to myself, did I know this was happening? No, I didn't know this was happening. I mean, India's tremendous industrial development is on the backs of these poor people.
With that, I think we'll bring this session to changing the food system in the Lowcountry to a close. But listen, first, Michelle, Joan, Wes, thank you very much. That was, as promised, provocative.